Every species with settlements old enough to remember the era before the Kryvant Ascendancy's expansion had some version of the same story, told slightly differently depending on which world you asked, but always built around the same core, that long before any current power rose to prominence, a species called the First Kindred had walked among the stars, vanished after some catastrophe none of the surviving legends agreed on the details of, and left behind, scattered across a few dozen forgotten worlds, sealed vaults that were never, under any circumstances, meant to be opened. The Ashwood natives who lived in the shadow of the ruined world's excavation site called them the Sleepers, and Elder Mira Thessk, who had guided 3 prior Kryvant survey teams through the outer ruins without incident, had spent the better part of 2 days trying to explain to Commander Draith Ilun exactly why the innermost vault was different from everything the prior teams had already cleared. Every dig site has a story warning people away from something, Ilun said, reviewing the vault's sealed entrance with the specific impatience of a commander whose survey timeline was already 3 days behind schedule. That's not evidence. That's how ruins get looted slower by superstitious locals. It is not a story about looting, Thessk said. It is a story about a door built to be a warning, not a lock. My grandmother's grandmother said the same door was here when her own grandmother was a child, sealed the same way, undisturbed. Nobody in that entire span of generations decided the risk of finding out what the warning meant was worth taking. Ilun's survey scanners had already confirmed what her superiors back at the Ascendancy's central archive most wanted to hear. The vault's construction techniques matched First Kindred architecture found at 2 other ruin sites, both of which had, once opened, yielded technology considerably beyond anything currently in Ascendancy production. Grand Curator Marin Solt, overseeing the Ascendancy's broader First Kindred recovery initiative from the capital, had made her expectations for this excavation explicit before Ilun's team ever departed: recover whatever technological knowledge the vault contained, regardless of local superstition, because a species advanced enough to leave ruins this sophisticated was, by definition, long extinct and in no position to object to the recovery effort. We open it, Ilun said. Today. The Grand Curator isn't interested in funding a 4th season of surveys because of a folktale. The vault door, once Ilun's engineering team finally breached its outer seal, revealed not a treasury of relics or a preserved archive, as the 2 prior sites had, but a single chamber at its center, a raised dais, and atop it, a device unlike anything catalogued from either prior excavation, a crystalline lattice structure, dormant, that began, the instant Ilun's scanning equipment made direct contact with its surface, to pulse with a slow, steady light that had clearly not been active in a very long time. Thessk, standing at the chamber's entrance, went very still. That is not a relic, she said quietly. That is the alarm. The story was never about the door, Commander. It was about what waking the door disturbs. Ilun did not immediately understand what she meant. She would understand, in full, within the week. The signal the Ashwood Vault emitted, once activated, did not travel through any communication network the Ascendancy's own instruments could trace, because it had never been built to use one. It traveled instead through a network of dormant relay beacons, seated across dozens of similarly sealed ruin worlds millennia earlier, each one designed to do exactly one thing if it ever received an activation signal from any other point in the network: relay it onward, unaltered, toward a single fixed destination that had not received such a signal in longer than any currently active Ascendancy record could confirm. That destination was Earth. Beneath a mountain range in what human historians still called, informally, the old Vigil, a facility considerably older and considerably better concealed than any of the classified defense programs more recent generations had built on top of it, a dormant monitoring station registered the incoming relay signal and, for the first time in over 4 centuries, activated a system that the small hereditary order responsible for its maintenance had begun to quietly suspect might never sound again in any of their lifetimes. Commander Elias Whitfield had inherited command of what his order called, simply, the Vigil from his predecessor 11 years earlier, along with a responsibility that had grown, across 4 centuries of silence, into something closer to ceremonial duty than active military readiness. He stood now in the Vigil's central chamber, watching a system schematic light up in patterns none of his order's records had ever needed to interpret in practice, only in theory. "That's a live relay," said Dr. Imogen Hale, the Order's chief archivist and the closest thing the Vigil had to a specialist in the First Kindred's original systems architecture. Ashwood Hollow. One of the outer sealed sites. Someone opened it. After 400 years of silence, Whitfield said. After considerably longer than that, if the Ashwood Vault is one of the original network nodes, Hale said. The relay only tells us the vault was opened. It doesn't tell us by whom, or why, or whether whoever did it understood what they were actually activating. What the Order's oldest records did make clear, records Whitfield's predecessors had maintained across generations specifically so that whoever eventually inherited the Vigil would understand exactly what the alarm meant, should it ever actually sound, was the reason the First Kindred, the ancient civilization now remembered across dozens of species as myth, had never actually vanished at all. They had chosen, after a catastrophic war that had cost them nearly everything, to withdraw entirely from galactic prominence, sealing away the worlds and technologies that had made them a target, and settling quietly on a single world their enemies at the time had considered too insignificant to bother finishing the job on. That world was Earth. The First Kindred were not a myth. They were humanity's own distant ancestors, and the alarm now sounding meant, according to every protocol the Vigil's order had maintained for exactly this possibility, that one of the old sealed sites had been breached by someone who did not understand what breaching it actually risked. "Wake the Custodian Fleet," Whitfield said. "Full activation protocol. If Ashwood Hollow's vault is open, whoever opened it needs to understand, quickly, exactly what they've done before they do anything that makes the situation considerably worse." Grand Curator Marin Solt received Ilun's report on the Ashwood Vault's contents with an interest considerably sharper than the excavation's prior findings had warranted. A dormant crystalline device, actively pulsing after millennia of confirmed inactivity, matched nothing in the Ascendancy's own technological catalog, and Solt's initial assessment, delivered to the Ascendancy's military command within hours of receiving Ilun's report, framed the discovery not as a warning system but as an opportunity. If the First Kindred built an active alarm network that has survived this long dormant, Solt told Fleet Marshal Corin Aldith, the technology underlying it represents a considerable strategic asset, regardless of its original purpose. "I want the vault's contents fully recovered and the network it's apparently part of mapped and secured before any rival power learns of its existence." Aldith's own instinct, considerably more cautious than Solt's, urged Restraint. "Grand Curator, we don't understand what this network actually does. If it was designed to summon something, securing it before we understand what we're summoning seems considerably riskier than the potential reward justifies." "The First Kindred are extinct," Solt said. "Whatever this network was designed to summon, if anything, has had millennia to fail to arrive. I am not interested in delaying a strategic opportunity because of a local myth neither of us has any evidence actually applies to a functioning alarm system rather than an inert relic." Aldith's caution, though overruled, proved considerably better founded than Solt's confidence. Within 36 hours of the Ashwood Vault's activation, Ascendancy sensor stations across the outer survey territories began registering a pattern Aldith's own intelligence staff struggled to classify: unregistered vessel signatures, appearing at the edge of long-range detection range near several of the Ascendancy's other known First Kindred excavation sites, holding position without approaching, as if observing rather than engaging. "They're watching our other dig sites," Aldith reported to Solt. "Multiple locations, simultaneously, all previously identified First Kindred ruin worlds. Whatever responded to the Ashwood activation, it isn't limited to a single location." Solt's response, rather than caution, was an order to accelerate the recovery effort across every active excavation site simultaneously, on the theory that whoever was observing represented a rival power attempting to claim the same technological advantage the Ascendancy had already identified, and that speed, not restraint, was now the correct strategic response. It was the second serious misjudgment the Ascendancy would make in the span of a single week, and it would prove considerably more costly than the first. The Custodian Fleet's initial response, dispatched from the Vigil under Commander Whitfield's direct authorization, was neither an attack nor a formal introduction. It was, exactly as centuries of protocol specified, a demonstration intended to communicate a single clear message before any further escalation became necessary, that the sealed sites remained protected, and that whoever had breached one needed to understand this immediately, without requiring a larger confrontation to make the point. 12 custodian vessels, a small fraction of the fleet's full strength, deployed deliberately as a restrained first response rather than a show of overwhelming force, appeared at the edge of the Ashwood excavation site sensor range, holding position at a distance that made their presence unmistakable without initiating direct engagement. Ilun's own sensor officer flagged the contacts within minutes. "Commander, 12 unregistered vessels, holding position at extreme range. Configuration doesn't match anything in the Ascendancy registry. They're not approaching. They appear to be observing." Ilun, still operating under Solt's accelerated recovery directive, made the decision that would define the Ascendancy's first direct engagement with a species it did not yet understand it was actually facing. "Dispatch an escort squadron to intercept and identify," she ordered. "If they're here to interfere with the recovery effort, I want that confirmed before we lose any more time to this excavation schedule." The Ascendancy escort squadron 8 vessels, dispatched to intercept the observing Custodian ships close to engagement range and, upon receiving no response to a formal identification hail, opened fire, initiating the first exchange between the Ascendancy and a power whose last confirmed military engagement predated the Ascendancy's own founding by a span of time its historians would later struggle to fully calculate. The Custodian response was immediate, precise, and considerably more restrained than the provocation technically justified, a coordinated disabling strike against the escort squadron's propulsion systems, delivered with a precision Ilun's own tactical officer described, in her report back to Solt, as disturbingly effortless. All 8 Ascendancy vessels disabled within the engagement's first 90 seconds, without a single confirmed casualty, and without the Custodian formation advancing a single meter closer to the excavation site itself. A channel opened on the Ascendancy fleet-wide frequency, carrying a message in a linguistic pattern Ilun's translation matrix took several seconds to process, because the underlying language structure predated anything in current Ascendancy linguistic archives. Once translated, the message was brief. This site is protected. Withdraw your recovery operation and return what has been removed. This will not be repeated as a warning. Solt's reaction to the escort squadron's disablement was not the withdrawal Aldith's report recommended, but a conclusion that compounded the Ascendancy's earlier misjudgment considerably further, that the Custodian Fleet's restrained, non-lethal response indicated a limited automated defense system, likely a remnant of First Kindred technology operating without genuine command authority behind it, rather than the deliberate, controlled response of an intact and highly disciplined military force. An automated system that disables rather than destroys is a system with programmed restraint limits, Solt told Aldith, overriding his continued recommendation for caution. If we commit sufficient force, either it exceeds its own operational parameters, or it runs out of whatever resources powering its defensive capability. Either outcome ends the interference with our recovery effort. Aldith's objection, delivered as formally as protocol allowed for a subordinate officer disagreeing with the Ascendancy's civilian leadership, was overruled a final time. The Ascendancy's 3rd Battle Fleet, 161 warships, drawn from the sector's standing defense reserve, was ordered to converge on the Ashwood system and secure the excavation site through direct military commitment, on the explicit understanding that whatever was defending the vault represented, at most, a sophisticated but ultimately finite automated deterrent. Commander Whitfield, monitoring the Ascendancy fleet's approach from the Vigil's coordination center, received the escalation report from the 12-ship observation squadron with the specific, weary patience of a commander who had studied his order's centuries-old protocols for exactly this contingency and had genuinely hoped never to need them. They've committed their main battle fleet, he told Hale. 161 ships, against 12 of ours, believing we're some kind of leftover automated system rather than an intact command structure. Do we correct that assumption, Hale asked, or let the engagement correct it for them? Whitfield considered the question with the weight of centuries of accumulated protocol behind it. We correct it as gently as the engagement allows, he said. The goal has never been to punish them for a mistake born of genuine ignorance. It's to make sure the mistake doesn't get repeated, by them or anyone else who eventually finds another one of the sealed sites. Full Custodian Fleet, minimum necessary force, maximum possible restraint. The full Custodian Fleet that met the Ascendancy's 3rd Battle Fleet at the edge of the Ashwood system numbered considerably more than the 12-ship observation squadron that had disabled the initial escort, 209 vessels, drawn from a standing readiness the Order had maintained, largely unseen and unused, across 4 centuries of quiet vigilance, built on technological foundations the First Kindred had refined over a civilizational history considerably longer than the Ascendancy's own recorded existence. Aldith, watching the Custodian formation's arrival on his own tactical display, understood within seconds that Solt's assessment of a limited automated system had been catastrophically wrong. That's not a defense remnant, he said, to no one in particular. That's a standing fleet. A full, coordinated, currently active standing fleet, larger than anything we committed. The engagement that followed unfolded with a precision that Ascendancy tactical analysts, reviewing the sensor data afterward, would describe as unlike anything in their prior combat records. The Custodian Fleet's response, coordinated through a command architecture that treated the entire 209-ship formation as a single continuous system rather than individually commanded vessels, disabled propulsion and weapons across section after section of the Ascendancy's 3rd Battle Fleet in a rolling, methodical sequence that never once escalated beyond the same restrained, non-lethal calibration the initial escort squadron had encountered. Within 40 minutes, 144 of the Ascendancy's 161 committed warships had lost propulsion, weapons capability, or both, without a single confirmed Ascendancy casualty across the entire engagement, a restraint that Aldith, watching his own flagship's tactical systems fail in the engagement's final minutes, found considerably more unsettling than outright destruction would have been. They could have ended this fleet entirely, at any point in the last 40 minutes, he said quietly, to his own tactical staff, as the last of his ship's systems went dark. They chose not to. That is not the behavior of a system running out of resources. That is the behavior of something that decided, deliberately, exactly how much force this situation actually required, and stopped there. A channel opened on the Ascendancy fleet-wide frequency. Commander Whitfield's voice came through, translated now into standard Ascendancy linguistic patterns rather than the archaic form the initial warning had used, common without any trace of triumph. Fleet Marshal Aldith. Your fleet is disabled, not destroyed. We would ask that you return what was removed from the Ashwood Vault, withdraw your recovery operations from every First Kindred site currently under Ascendancy excavation, and understand, going forward, that these sites remain protected by an active and intact authority, not a myth, and not an abandoned relic. We are not interested in conflict with the Ascendancy. We are interested in making certain this particular misunderstanding does not need to happen a second time. News of the Ashwood engagement reached the wider sector within days, carried not through any deliberate broadcast. Whitfield's order had no interest in announcing themselves to a galaxy that had, for centuries, comfortably assumed they no longer existed, but through the Ascendancy's own diplomatic channels, as Solt found herself obligated to explain, to increasingly skeptical allied powers, exactly how a routine archaeological recovery effort had resulted in 144 disabled warships and a formal withdrawal from every First Kindred excavation site the Ascendancy currently maintained. The revelation that followed, confirmed independently by several allied powers whose own historical records included fragments of the same First Kindred legend, once they were permitted, through a carefully limited diplomatic channel Whitfield's order finally opened, to compare notes directly with representatives of what the legend had actually described, produced a reassessment across the sector considerably more significant than the Ashwood engagement itself. Elder Mira Thessk, whose warnings Ilun had dismissed as superstition 3 weeks earlier, was among the first outside the Ascendancy's own command structure to receive formal confirmation, delivered personally by Dr. Hale during a diplomatic visit to the Ashwood system that Whitfield's order had authorized specifically to address the local Ashwood community's long-standing relationship with the sealed vault their ancestors had guarded, unknowingly, for generations. Your grandmother's grandmother was right, Hale told her. The story was never about a door. It was about understanding when not to open something simply because you finally could. Grand Curator Solt, facing a formal review from the Ascendancy's own governing council over the scale of the diplomatic and military misjudgment the Ashwood engagement represented, offered a final assessment considerably more candid than her original recovery directive had reflected. I assessed a dormant myth as a resource to be claimed, she told the review council, because every prior encounter with First Kindred technology across this sector's history had involved sites that were, genuinely, abandoned. I had no framework for the possibility that one site might still be actively defended by the descendants of the civilization that built it. I do not believe that assumption was unreasonable, given the evidence available to us at the time. I do believe it will not be a safe assumption for this Ascendancy, or for any other power in this sector, to make again. The formal terms Whitfield's order negotiated with the Ascendancy in the weeks following the engagement were, by design, minimal, full return of everything removed from the Ashwood Vault, formal withdrawal from all other First Kindred sites, and a limited, carefully bounded diplomatic channel through which future contact could occur without requiring another alarm to sound first. No demand for reparations. No demand for territory. No attempt to leverage the engagement's outcome into any broader claim on galactic authority. We could have used this to re-establish ourselves as a dominant power across this entire sector, Hale observed, reviewing the modest terms before they were finalized. The Ascendancy would have had very little standing to refuse considerably more than this. That was never the point of the Vigil, Whitfield said. We didn't withdraw from galactic prominence 4 centuries ago because we lost the capacity to hold it. We withdrew because we learned, at considerable cost, exactly what holding it too tightly eventually does to a civilization. The alarm exists to protect what's left of that lesson, not to relaunch us back into the position that taught it to us in the first place. 3 weeks after the engagement, Lieutenant Kian Ashby, the youngest officer in the Custodian Fleet's active command roster, stood watch in the Vigil's central chamber, the great alarm system finally settling back into silence after 4 centuries of dormancy interrupted by a single, eventful week. He had grown up within the Order's tradition, understanding the Vigil's purpose only in the abstract, a duty inherited rather than tested. He understood it differently now. It's strange, he said to Whitfield, who had joined him for the final watch of the standing down cycle, knowing the whole galaxy still thinks we're a legend, even after this. The Ascendancy knows. A handful of their allies know. Everyone else still tells the same old story. Let them, Whitfield said. A legend that occasionally rings an alarm and quietly corrects a mistake, then goes back to silence, does considerably less damage to a galaxy still learning how to handle power responsibly than a known civilization sitting visibly at the center of it ever could. We're not trying to be remembered, Kian. We're trying to make sure nobody has to learn what we learned the same way we learned it. In a small archival annex within the Custodian Order's own historical record, Dr. Hale filed a final entry into a log that had, across 4 centuries, recorded remarkably few actual events, a record maintained more out of institutional discipline than any expectation it would ever need updating again. She reviewed the Ashwood engagement's full account one final time before closing the file, and added a note that would sit, unread by anyone outside the Order, for however many generations passed before the next alarm, if it ever came, required someone to read it again. The Ashwood Vault was breached and the alarm answered within protocol. Minimum necessary force was used, maximum restraint was maintained throughout. The Ascendancy's misjudgment was born of genuine ignorance rather than hostile intent, and was corrected without lasting harm to either side. The legend holds. The Vigil continues. May whoever reads this next find the silence between alarms considerably longer than we did. No one ever revised it.